I am so excited, and I'm going to work really, really hard on staying in one stationary spot, which is not an easy thing for me. Luckily, I don't have to actually hold the microphone because that gets really bad because I'm like this all the time. But I will try really hard to stay in front of the camera for the web people. So like you said, my name is Lee. Spelled funny, nobody ever knows how to pronounce it, but I'm Lee. I'm a therapist supervisor, and I specialize in parents on difficult parenting journeys. And so typically that means that I'm working with either parents of kids with special needs or parents by adoption. And the majority of the parents that I see, I often see in couples therapy. I'm a therapy supervisor. I'm a couples counseling supervisor candidate, but I'm also a PCDH19 mom. And like I mentioned earlier, we have all sorts of diversity in my house. So I kind of walk that line for both. I love the picture I've got up here because a few years ago, I was in the Facebook group and I was like, we're having this really frustrating thing where my daughter is like 13 and wants to dress like a princess, and neurotypical kids don't do that. And so the biggest princess dress you can get is like the size 8, right? And Julie says, well, Violet has this dress. Let me send it to you. And we live in this dress. And when we were getting ready for our Christmas pictures, I was like, okay, everybody, go get on a nice outfit. And my daughter, Alyssa, the one in the yellow, goes, oh my goodness. And she runs across the house and comes back in this. And I was like, we'll do it. So that was our Christmas card. Okay. Can I make the bar go away? It's in my. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So this is my crew. My husband and I we have 4 kiddos, 3 of whom are adopted, all of whom are unique. But so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about parenting stress and trauma and grief. And typically I'm either giving this talk to parents or to professionals. And it's really fun to be able to kind of do the both. I'm really skewing it towards parents, but I'm going to talk some about specifically the goals that we want to think about as professionals too. Okay. So when we talk about special needs parenting, I like to think about it like a journey. This is a Hobbit style journey. So if you're not a Lord of the Rings fan, what I mean by this is that you're kind of going through life and all of a sudden you are thrust out of your house on this grand adventure that you were completely unprepared for. And on this adventure, you go through all sorts of terrains and stages, and occasionally an orc jumps out of the woods and tries to eat you. And so we're going to talk about what those things look like. But we also do this from a space of recognizing that on this journey, we go through all sorts of responses and they make perfect sense. The things that you're doing are completely adaptive. The way that you're feeling is exactly the way you're designed to do. So we want to learn how to manage that. We want to learn how to do to survive this journey. But we also recognize that it's hard. And part of the reason that we asked that people have their kiddos out of this is because we want to talk about the real truth that this is hard. This is not typical parenting. Typical parents go on a journey to Walmart one afternoon. We go to Mount Doom. Like, this is not the same. And so, but we don't want our kids to feel like the hard thing is them. PCDH19 is hard. Autism is hard. Epilepsy is hard. Finding resources and all of these things can be absolutely excruciating, but it's not that our kids are the problem. They're the good thing. And so I don't want them to feel like it's them, but we have to recognize as parents that this is not a typical journey. Okay. So like I said, I think about grief as these different terrains. When people talk about grief, they often say things like there's these stages of grief, and then you're in denial and then anger, and it's this pretty little cycle, and then you're done. And that doesn't work here. because it doesn't end. There's not a spot where you just like check the boxes and everything's good. This is the journey. This is the terrains that we go through. What we want to really recognize from the start, though, is that there is a purpose to every one of those stages. And so it's important that we recognize where we are and that we respond appropriately to where we are, because the way that I'm going to help somebody who's in denial is going to look completely different than the way I'm going to help somebody who's in anger. I can't just combine those. And the things that help you when you're in a bargaining spot are going to look really different than the things that are going to help you when you're in acceptance. So we recognize those spaces where we're at and we respond appropriately.
Just, I want to make the screen bigger.
Okay.
For some reason. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
There we go.
Awesome. Okay. So we start off with denial. And sometimes, especially medical professionals, can really struggle when they're seeing parents in denial. And there can be this push, like, I need you to accept this, right? Denial is a protective state. Denial is when our brains say, this is too much, this is not the way the world was supposed to look, and I cannot take this in. Denial is not a bad thing. It's not. If we get stuck there too long, that can be problematic, but denial itself is not bad. When we're in denial, we're looking at these things like having trouble believing our diagnosis, accepting the whole situation. We start to get really frozen sometimes. And our challenge there is that it can make it very hard to act. So what I want to do is I want to think about what the parent does and what the professional does. As the professional, I'm going to get really, really small. If I've got somebody in denial, I'm going to purposely figure out what is the thing that has to happen right now. What's urgent? And I don't actually care if they accept anything else right there. You don't have to accept when your kiddo is 6 months old and you're getting a diagnosis that they may not go to college. Like, you've got years for that. That's not urgent. I do need you to get into ECI, right? I do need you to get those early interventions and to get therapies going, because that's an urgent piece. And if we wait too long to get those started, we're going to have problems going on, right? So I don't need you to take the diagnosis in if you're not ready for that. We can go slow. I just need you to get slow. I need to get small enough to be able to, like, hey, what's our next step? Like, let's get a speech assessment. Let's make sure they're swallowing. Let's get an OT, right? We're going to go really, really small. And as the parent, I'm going to give myself permission to slow way, way down and figure out what are the things that I need to accept right now and what are the things that I can hold off on. It's okay to slow down, right? And a lot of these things, it takes a while. It took me a year to be able to say out loud, and there was a lot of like reasons why, but it took me a year to be able to tell someone, my daughter has PCDH19 epilepsy. Like, that was not a thing that I was allowed to say, right? And you know what? Nothing changed, right? I could still Google, I could still talk to Julie, I could still get the services I needed. And as I healed enough, then I could say the things out loud, right? So it's okay to go slow. We are not in a rush. There's not any check boxes here. We're gonna look in this space on self-care that is very, very gentle, right? So in this space in particular, I'm looking for things that are nourishing. I'm asking my people to make sure they eat every day. I'm talking about things like, have you showered, right? Like, are there things that you can do that help? And I'm going really soft here. Like, can you have a friend that sits with you for a little while? Can we put some lotion on? Are there things that nourish your body? Like, can we get massages, right? This is a spot. If you're angry and I tell you to go get a massage, that's a total mismatch, right? But if you're in this spot and we're doing something like that, that gets you some really great skin to skin that's helping your body soothe, that's really nourishing right there. So we're looking at things that kind of feed our souls. And the more that we do that, the more that we get through this really hard place. Right? Because in this spot, we're really focused on just surviving in the moment. And as we do that, we get better at it. So I like to think about my husband and I have a giant dually diesel truck, and I pull a 40-foot camper with it. I've pulled it from Texas to Niagara Falls. I've done the whole West Coast. And most of the time it's just me and my kids, and then he'll fly in with us when he's off work. But the very first time that I was pulling it, I was going to be pulling it by myself in the mountains. We were all scared, right? And I was very, very brand new at pulling a trailer at all. And so I spend this whole day driving through the mountains with him, and we get to Denver where he's gonna leave the next day. And we drive through Denver and we stop somewhere, and he gets in the car or in the truck, and he's there for a second, and then he looks over at me with this look, and he's like, "What the hell did you do?" And I had taken all of the mirrors on my truck and pointed them at the tires. And that way I could drive all day long and make sure my tires stayed between the lines. So my camper was between the lines and my giant, massive dualies were in the lines. And he's like, "Why did you do that?" And I was like, "Well, I didn't fall off the mountain." He's like, "Well, what if we needed to change lanes? We just drove all the way through Denver." I was like, "We didn't change lanes. We did not change lanes." Like, it was a thing. This was the only thing I could focus on, and we stayed on the road, right? And now I've drove a lot of places, and I can drive around and have my mirrors turned where they need to be and, notice things besides the lines. But that's where I started, right? If you're in a spot where you're just focused on, I'm surviving today, I'm looking at the piece that I can take in just today, that's enough. That's okay. Right? A lot of times we don't always go through these in this order. We bounce around a lot. But a lot of times we then go into anger. Anger is incredibly important. Anger helps us fight for something different, right? So anger can come out in different ways, though. Sometimes it gets really, really hot and it looks like blaming myself, blaming other people. It can be these big outbursts. It can be fighting the prognosis, which can actually be a really healthy thing. You'll sometimes see people doing things like, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do this giant fundraiser, or I'm gonna fight and I'm gonna make sure I get second opinions. I'm gonna do these things. And these help our kids stay alive. So this is not a pathological thing. This is not a you need to heal yourself kind of thing. If it's out of control or if it's causing problems, we address that. But if you're angry and that anger helps you show up at the principal's office and demand that they keep your kids safe, that anger is a good thing, right? So we want to help people facilitate anger into a healthy spot. We want to look for healthy outlets. Sometimes that anger gets too big or we don't have a good way to express it. It can get in the way of getting services, or it can cause damage to relationships. So that's the thing that we're kind of looking out for, but we're not going to just try to not be angry. Anger tells me that there's been a violation. Every emotion tells me something about my world, and anger tells me a violation. It's a violation. This was not the contract I had with the universe. This is not what my kid was supposed to look like or what my family was supposed to look like. And so of course you're going to be angry. Or this is not the way these professionals were supposed to act. Of course you're going to be angry, right? And that anger gives you the power. The other challenge that can sometimes happen with anger is that because it's a very expensive emotion, it takes a lot out of your body. If we stay angry too long, we can get really burnt out. Right? We can get really depleted because it takes so much out of it. But anger, when it's got somewhere to go, is a really healthy thing and is something that our children need from us, right? And so as parents, we're looking for things that we can do, like maybe we're writing letters, especially the ones that we're not going to send, or we're doing things like advocacy. If we're thinking about self-care kind of stuff, we are especially looking for things with big body movements. So I'm looking for something that gives that adrenaline in my body a place to go, right? So this is a spot where things like hitting a punching bag can be fantastic, or going for a walk and getting your heart rate up. I'll have some people that will even do wall push-ups, and so they'll go and they'll talk to the doctor, and then they'll go in the bathroom and do wall push-ups, and they're getting some kind of stimulus in their arms. They're doing something with all that stuff happening in their bodies so that then they can re-regulate, right? But we're really looking for that stuff that gives that anger something to do. And then another one that we do is bargaining. Bargaining is the reason every single person in this room is here today. Bargaining is where we say, I can't handle this like it is, and so I'm going to try to change it. Now, sometimes that looks like figuring out how we could go back and make things different. A lot of times it's if I just do this, then they will do this, right? This is why you see a lot of parents who are newly diagnosed that get really involved in advocacy efforts, because it's like, there's not an option for my kiddos, so I'm going to go out and create one, right? Again, these aren't bad things. Bargaining has specifically improved our children's lives. Bargaining gets the research dollars that help us get a cure. It funds the alliance, it creates the alliance. It does these things that help our children. So we're not trying to move through this. We're not trying to erase it or skip it. We're just trying to keep it in a healthy way. Some of the challenges that we can see in this spot is that it can sometimes turn into self-blame. We're having this problem because I didn't do enough, because I wasn't whatever enough. And sometimes it can cause problems in couples, especially because you'll have different ideas about what that looks like or what the resources of the family are. So if one person is like, I have to travel to every single possible hospital that might know something, and the other person is like, we can't afford that, then there's conflict, right? And often it looks like to the people stuck in the middle of it, it looks like they don't care enough because they're not willing to do this thing. If they loved our kid enough, then they would go do this, right? And you're each showing love in different ways. And often in couples, we're not in the same spots at the same time in the first place, right? And so that's one of the things that we're really looking at, where we want to, as parents, really focus on things that are realistic for our families. So yes, we want to do advocacy. Yes, we want to look for other opinions or other treatments. We want to really take that time to step back and make sure we're not going to do damage, right? Like if I spend $40,000 on an experimental treatment and it doesn't work, then my family might be in a bind, right? And so we're really looking for those realistic options. We want to do things like get involved in community, and we want to make sure, and this is a hard one, that we're paying attention to what our kiddos want in this spot especially. Because sometimes what you'll see is people who are like, I'm going to tell my kids' story everywhere and we're going to do this. And some kids are like, yeah, put me in the spotlight. And some kids don't want that, right? Or some kids are like, actually, I've had 87 therapies this week. I don't want to go to another one, right? And so that's a spot where we really want to make sure that we're slowing down to pay attention to what the kiddo wants. And sometimes with a big disorder like this, that's extra hard because there's so much pressure that says, I have to fix this. I have to make this better. This is life limiting or life shortening, or this is devastating in every way I know. And so there's so much pressure that says we have to fix it that it's really hard to make that choice to slow down, right? And so as professionals, what we really want to do is normalize that parent reaction and then really support them in ways of, here's a thing that we can find for you to get involved in. Here's a way that you can make realistic change. We're not just pacifying people, but here's a way that you make change, and then in a way that doesn't cause harm to your family, to your child, to your finances, to whatever domain that is. And then a lot of times, especially when we've been on this journey for a while, we get stuck in depression. And again, depression makes sense, right? Sadness tells me that there was a loss. And there are a lot of losses on this journey, right? Every one of us comes into this world with an idea of what parenting is going to look like, of what our kids are going to experience, of what we're going to leave behind for them. And we lose a lot of that. And this is where it's incredibly important, especially as professionals, that we differentiate this from typical parenting. Because a typical parent might think about, like, when I have kids, I'm going to have a football star, right? And they have these big dreams. And if that football star instead grows up to love chess, then they can be disappointed, valid, all the things. But there's a really big difference between that and imagining your kid being a football star and instead they can't walk. Those are not the same. We're on different playing fields. And so we're going to recognize that and we're going to own that. Of course, you are going to grieve this. Of course, you're going to be sad. So a lot of times in this spot, we start to lack motivation. We start to really isolate. This is a spot where you start seeing parents and they're not, especially parents that have always worked really, really hard. They've done everything. They've come and researched. They've done all this stuff. And all of a sudden, maybe they're canceling appointments or they're having trouble and they're coming in and they just don't have that energy. Then we're starting to see them like really, really struggle under the weight of it. One of the things that we're especially watching out for here, particularly with moms, is what we call functional depression. So functional depression means that as a mom, I do not have the freedom to do depression like it looks like on TV. I can't just lock myself in the room and turn off all the lights and hide there all day because I have to get up and feed my kids, right? They're going to insist on it. I have to go to their appointments. I have to take care of them. I have to make sure they're doing all their stuff. I have to feed them. I physically can't do depression like my body might want me to do depression. And so functional depression looks like mom's doing all the things that have to get done, but anything that doesn't have to get done starts to slip. Or she's not sleeping. A lot of times this gets missed because it doesn't look typical, right? We're not sleeping, our bodies are really struggling, your thoughts start to get really, really dark. And sometimes it's especially hard to get help right there because people look and they see, oh, this is this mom that's so strong and they do all of this stuff. Oh, you telling me that you're thinking about suicide doesn't match, right? Are you telling me that you're just devastated and you just lay at night thinking about how awful life is? That doesn't match with how I see you, right? But that's how it typically shows up for moms in particular, okay? This is where, as professionals, where we're keeping an eye out for suicide. Because if it's going to happen, typically it's right here. We fought and we fought and we fought and we've run out of fight, right? And so we're looking at ways that I can pay attention and I can build you up. And I'm in particular going to look for ways that I can build you up in the way that makes sense for you, right? So, so we had an issue. My daughter, has all the behaviors that PCDH19 kids do, right? And so several weeks ago, I'm talking to my therapist and I was really upset. And I'm like, we had a hard weekend. I'm like showing her the bite mark on my arm, all the things, right? And she's like, oh my goodness, is it usually this bad? And I was like, oh, actually it's been way worse than this. This I doesn't pop at all. And she lets herself slow down and get curious. And she's like, okay, well, what's different here? What's hard right now for here? So, oh, well, her behavior's bad enough that she might get kicked out of children's church. And if she gets kicked out of children's church, I can't go to my life group on Wednesday nights. And that's my support, right? And so if you want to help me in that spot, you're not giving me any behavioral interventions. You're not helping me accept where she's at. You're going to help us figure out how we keep her in children's church, right? That's the thing that matters right there. Right? So we're looking for those things that the parent sees as incredibly as important as the thing that feels like they can't handle it. And often for parents, it's the smaller things. Like if you need me to manage something massive, I can do that. But if I'm in this spot and you ask me to do something small, I might not be able to, right? And so those are the spots that daily tasks get really overwhelming. So I'm really looking on giving people the space to grieve the losses. Like, we just give permission for it. This is sad and it is hard. And of course, we're going to grieve, right? We're looking on ways that we can connect, especially with other parents in the same spot, right? And we're looking for ways that we support families in the ways that matter to them. Right? And then we get to this spot we call acceptance. Acceptance is not everything is fantastic and it's beautiful and rainbows and wonderful. Acceptance is, I know how to handle it right now. I know how to carry this while I keep going down the journey. Right? You find your normal. And you get to the place where you're like, it's okay that my normal doesn't look like anybody else's normal. This is different and that's all right. You start to feel more competent in managing the disability, right? And so we were talking the other night, some of us families about the seizures, and you can kind of see this space where different families are, and all of the spaces are okay. But some of the families are like, well, yeah, we can handle a cluster at home because we know this, and it doesn't really rock us. We've got it. And some of the families are like, well, this one, when it happens like this, we can handle it, and not when it's like this, right? And some of the families are like, this is brand new and this is scary, so we're going to the hospital every time. It's like, absolutely. That's exactly what you should be doing, right? But sometimes in acceptance, either we're like old hands and we know how to manage the hospital really well if that's what we need to do, or we've kind of figured out how to manage things. And a lot of times in this spot, we start to feel really competent in there. So either we start to kind of have a little season of peace, or sometimes what you'll see is that those other things that we haven't had the bandwidth to address start to finally show up for us, and that gets really big. This is a spot where a lot of times people go to therapy because it's the first time that they've had any space to be able to pay attention to themselves, right? Because as parents, if my kid needs therapy and I need therapy, but we can only do one, they're going to therapy, right? Like, that's how that works. If one of us has to go to the doctor, or if only one of us can go to the doctor, it's going to be them, right? But this is that space where there's enough capability to handle my child that I can handle the other things. Sometimes this is a space where marriages start to really struggle because we've spent so much time in survival mode that now we can, like, the dust is starting to settle. And so now we're all of a sudden in that spot of like, I don't know you anymore. Or here's this thing that happened and I'm getting hit with it and I'm hurt by it. Right? For some people, it gets really scary in this spot. And especially with a disorder like PCDH19, because we kind of have this feeling that it's going to come back and I don't know how it's going to come back. I don't know the when, and I don't know what that's going to look like. And so that can be a really scary thing. It's like that sword over your head. Parents in this spot, we're going to practice gratitude. We're going to purposely, and we're going to practice gratitude for the things that we're actually grateful for. So you will never in my life hear me say that I'm grateful for PCDH19. Absolutely not. Am I deeply grateful for the Alliance? Absolutely. Right? Am I deeply grateful for the connections I've made or the way I've grown or things that I've learned? Yes. Right? But I'm not going to lie and pretend like I'm grateful for the disease. Right? I'm going to go do gratitude for the things that are actually deserving of gratitude. Okay. I'm going to work on creating systems that make sense for my family. And as professionals, we're going to give parents space to work through traumas that they've accumulated, or even just give them space to focus on resting in this spot and shift to the things that are coming up that they need help with. Okay. But remember, wherever you are is where you are. This isn't a race. This isn't a completion. This is just recognizing the terrain that you're in the moment and noticing, here's why that's happening. Here's how it's showing up. And here's what I need right here. Okay. We just want to cope and grow wherever it is that we are in the moment. So in addition to those stages or those terrains of grief that we go through, we also experience stress and trauma, right? And again, stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Stress puts me into survival mode and it helps me keep my kid alive. So We think about this in a couple of different ways. So we think about this short-term stress where things get really, really scary. Maybe we're in the middle of dealing with a seizure, or maybe we're dealing with some of that long-term stress of, I have to do all this extra stuff for the school every single day, or, that kind of stuff. And it just kind of accumulates, right? So we have the acute, we have the chronic, and then especially once we're in that acceptance spot, a lot of times we have this fringe stress. And so fringe stress means that I have these extra pieces that make other things harder, right? If I have to have my kid in therapy, then I'm scheduling other things around it, right? So it's not actually like that's a very manageable thing, but it's making other things more complicated, right? And there's a constant like addition to life that I have to add on to. And over time, that builds up, right? And so what we want to remember is that stress and even trauma is something that we're actually very well designed to manage. We think about it like if you're out in the wild and you're going through the forest, stress or trauma is a bear jumps out of a cave and tries to eat you, right? And so in that spot, we grab a stick and we start swinging, we run like hell, we drop down, we play dead. And in a relatively short amount of time, either the bear eats you or you're okay, right? That's how that works. That's that acute stress. Kiddo has a seizure, I give them the medicine, the rescue meds, they're okay. And then if I take care of myself afterwards and we resolve that stress, then it just kind of goes on, right? That's how it's supposed to look. Parenting kiddos with life-limiting or long-term challenges like this, instead of it being that you occasionally get chased by a bear, it's more like living in a bear cave. Right? And there's physiological changes to our bodies because of that, because we are not made to stay at that level of stress long-term. Right? And so it's going to impact different parents in different ways at different times. But what we often see is that the act of parenting starts to become traumatic, and because that stress builds up or is so acute. Right? And so if we think about the normal ways that stress would look, right? We get this threat, our body shoots out adrenaline, we do fight, flight, freeze, we survive it, we celebrate our survival, we go back to baseline. Okay? With our kiddos, it might instead look like my kid starts screaming, and as soon as I hear that, my whole body reacts, right? My kid starts getting a little bit loud, and I don't even care if it's that they're in there playing video games and laughing, or if they're a fight. Either way, that your body, if you've done it long enough, is probably having the same reaction, right? But your kiddos start screaming, and so your body has this big reaction, and you go into fight, flight, or freeze, and you're trying to manage it. And maybe you do this really great job, and you kind of get it like managed, and you get your kiddos stable again, and your body's like, yeah, but it could still be going on or it could come back, and we get stuck in that stress response, and we don't do anything that resolves it. And then our kids raise their voices again the next day, and we just keep spinning, right? Or maybe we have a day where instead we don't do this really great informed response, and we yell at our kids instead. And so then we're adding shame to it, right? And it's this constant accumulation that doesn't end in the way that evolutionary-wise stress is kind of created to resolve. Okay? And sometimes the stress is big enough that it's trauma. So when we talk about trauma, I think about it like a snow globe. So it's like you're living life in this snow globe, and all of a sudden somebody comes up and they grab your snow globe and they start to shake it violently. And then they slam it down on the table, and everything is white and it's chaotic. And eventually, the thing that differentiates it when I'm talking trauma from when I'm talking stress is that when it's trauma, eventually you have this space where all the little snow comes back to the ground, but it will never look the same again. That's a snow globe moment. That's what trauma is. That's why for a lot of us, hearing the diagnosis is traumatic, right? Because there is a before and after. You can clearly delineate your life right there, right? somebody shook our stove globes and we can learn to survive in this new landscape, right? We can figure that out, we can manage it, but it's not ever going to be the same again. Often trauma involves either a threat to the kiddo. Our brains register threats to our children's lives at the same degree of intensity that they do as a survival risk to ourselves. It can be a threat to attachment, but our own survival response is triggered. A lot of times this is complicated when our own people aren't available to us. So we know that pre-COVID, about 40% of moms walked out of the NICU with PTSD. And we expect that as we start researching it, that number is going to be especially higher, because especially when COVID got super bad, those moms were in the NICU, at least in our hospitals, moms were in the NICU by themselves. They told parents, only one of you can be here. And so you're watching your baby attached to all these wires, and you don't know if they're gonna die, and you're there by yourself. We had a family whose kiddo had to have a surgery that they did not expect them to survive early on in COVID. And they told the family, only one of you is allowed in the hospital. And so mom is upstairs waiting to see if her kid's alive. And dad is in his car in the parking lot, waiting on a call to see if his kid's alive. And in that moment, not only are they facing the scariest moment of their life, but they're also completely out of their control, not because they are abandoning each other, but they are in fact abandoned because their person cannot be there with them, right? And it breaks your snow globe. Sometimes a part that gets missed a lot when we talk about this is that sometimes our child can be the one that is the danger, whether it's to themselves or to us, especially when we're talking about really big meltdowns. And so where our bodies start to have these reactions that make perfect sense, but people don't like to see that you're having that reaction to someone like you would to a criminal when it's your own little one. So we've got to recognize it. We've got to call it trauma. Historically, a lot of people have called it secondary trauma. They've said, oh, well, it's because you watched your child go through something. It's because your child told you about what they experienced, right? And our children go through the trauma, right? Like, this is not an either or. Our children experience trauma in their own medical journey. But as parents, this is not secondary trauma. Some people can have secondary trauma. I've not ever had a family come to me in my practice that was telling me that they were struggling because of what they heard. I have them come to me because of what they experience. That is true trauma. And in this spot, if we're throwing things like parenting classes at them, that's not going to help anybody. We have to treat this like it's trauma. But we also recognize that trauma and love completely coexist. I can be traumatized by this experience of parenting and also deeply value my children. This is not an either or, this is a both. Okay. So when we're looking at that trauma and how it impacts parents, they had a study come out a few years ago, and they looked at moms of kids with autism, and they had cortisol levels that were similar to soldiers in combat, right? This is extremely high stress. This is not typical parenting. Moms of kids with special needs tend to die earlier. We're more likely to suffer from dementia. We often have PTSD. I see a high proportion of the clients I work with have diagnosable PTSD. And we miss that a lot. And a lot of times it makes sense because we're really focused on the kid or how we make this family functional, but we miss a piece if we don't stop and slow down and recognize what's actually the root of a big part of our challenges. The trauma impacts kids too. So if I see you as a bear, it's a lot harder to cuddle with you, right? If I'm in that spot of feeling like I'm living in a bear cave and everything is dangerous and you might die any moment, and I'm supposed to lean in and hold you and love you, those are conflicting things in my body. My body is like, no, we got to go away. We got to get safe. And then my mama heart is like, no, I got to lean in. And that's a mismatch. right? We gotta allow that, and that can cause problems in the relationship with our children, right? But we also know that when we do that, when we support the parents, that it helps the kids. So the best thing that a parent can do for their children is go to therapy themselves. Like that's what the research shows. If we do foster kids who have huge amounts of trauma, if the foster parents get help, kids' cortisol levels go down, right? If we get parents help, and they're more likely to get the kiddos in therapy. They're more likely to be compliant with treatment plans, and they're better able to support the siblings, which is often one of the biggest concerns for parents. We also have a huge impact on our relationships as parents. And so a lot of times couples get stuck in really rigid roles. This is this person's job and this is this person's job. And again, there's a value to that, right? Some of our kids, especially when they're super complex, it would not make sense to have parents trading off doctor's appointments. Something gets missed there. If we have one parent in a lot of families, not all, right? But so for a lot of families, if you have one person and they're kind of like the lead on, I'm the one that talks to the doctors, or I'm the one that handles this part, they're better able to keep our kiddos safe and manage things because they've got the idea of what's going on. So the roles aren't a problem until they become so rigid that we can't help each other out or we're stuck, right? Until they don't work for us anymore. And when they don't, then sometimes we get triangulated, especially with our kiddos, we get isolated, and a lot of times it leads to divorce. But the thing is that it doesn't have to. If we treat these relationships the right way, if we really look at what, like there's a thing called emotionally focused therapy, which is what I practice. If we look at that with parents with special needs kids, then we don't see the increase in divorce rates. If we try to give skills, if we tell them, here's more things you're supposed to do, divorce rates skyrocket, right? But if we go to those roots and we help people address the trauma and the grief, then we can have really strong, beautiful relationships. We also don't walk into parenting with only parenting. So a lot of people come into parenting with their own existing trauma. Right? And so we want to recognize that in a couple of ways. So if you have previous trauma, sometimes walking through things for your kiddo is going to trigger that stuff. Sometimes it's going to impact how you show up as a parent, right? Like maybe it's harder for you to do certain things. I always want to pay attention to if my client had childhood trauma, how that trauma as a kid would have been impacted by their child's disability or behaviors. Okay? And here's what that means. If you learn as a little bitty that when drunk uncle shows up at my house, I climb out the window and I run as fast as I could to grandma's and I'm safe. And your child cannot walk, then your brain registers that disability as unsafe. That's not a lack of acceptance, that's a danger cue, because that tells me my child's not safe. How are they going to get away if they have mobility issues, right? Now, when we recognize this, then we can slow down and we can be like, oh, you know what? That was so scary for me. I have built something so very different for my child, right? If you, as a kiddo, learned that when dad gets home, you become a people pleaser and you go quiet and you do everything you're supposed to do, and you have a child who screams and has violent meltdowns, then not only is it a huge sensory overwhelm, but it's danger. Because if you did that, you'd have gotten hurt. You would have maybe even got like severely injured. It was not a safe thing. And so our brains register that as danger. Okay? And so we're always paying attention to that, because when that gets triggered, we go into that survival response. And a lot of times we respond in ways that we don't want to be responding. And we do that because our brain's like, hey, here's how we handle this trauma, right? But we're working to create these much safer spaces for our children. And so we're going to slow ourselves down enough that we can let ourselves know, hey, you know what? That was so scary and hard for me. My kid's not in that danger, right? My kiddo will never experience that. I'm making things safe for them. Right? Sometimes parents will blame their kids' struggle on their own trauma, right? And so we're just slowing things down, right? Like we're gonna make things better for our kiddos, but we're gonna recognize how those trauma interplay. And as we do that, we're gonna pay attention to the tools that we need for this journey. So we're gonna notice that, like one of the people earlier was talking about, this impacts every aspect of who we are, right? We don't just have one piece of us go down the journey. That's not how that works. Like all of us is on the road. Right? And so we're looking at our support systems and our physical health and our relationships and our careers and our self-views and all of the things. And we're gonna really notice what it is that we're struggling with in the moment and which part we need to focus on addressing. And we're gonna start looking for ways that we speak our truths, right? So I need to find a spot where I can tell my whole story. That's one of the most beautiful things about a spot like this, is that you're allowed to show up and say, here's what this looked like. Let me tell you what happened for me, right? And people actually believe you and they can hold space for it because they've been there too, right? That gets tricky when we're talking about things from parenting because we don't want to tell our kids' story. But as a parent, I've got a story too, and I have to have a spot to tell it. Right? We're going to honor all the parts of you that get big. We're going to look for kind of middle ground thoughts, like everything's like, I'm a complete failure. Like, no, I've made some mistakes, right? We're kind of looking for that middle ground. And we're going to notice when things come up that are the things that we're supposed to say. I'm so grateful for this. Or people come up and they're like, oh my goodness, you're such a saint. And you're like, I'm really not, right? And we're just gonna find those places where we can speak truth. Here's who I really am. I'm an absolute mess, right? And I love my kids so much, right? Here's my story. We're telling the truth. We're gonna personify the enemy. So early on, when I got really, really mad, I was doing MMA. And which is perfect when you're mad. I swear it saved my life. But we would do these practice where you would do the fast punches, right? And I got to the place where I would do PCDH19, PCDH19, right? And you're giving it a space, like I'm gonna punch it as hard as I can, right? I'm looking for a way that I find my enemy. My enemy is not my child, right? It's never the child. The enemy is not my partner. The enemy is the disease. The enemy is the systems. The enemy is something, right? But it's not my child. So I'm going to look for a way that I can personify that so that I can point my anger towards something. Okay. And if we're couples, we're going to start trying to create a narrative where we're fighting that enemy together. We're also going to acknowledge the loss, right? Explicitly. And a lot of people get in this space where they feel like, oh, that was little, or the kids have had so much harder, and we kind of just keep pushing things down, right? I can't afford to stop and feel that. So when I was a kid, my dad's a horse trainer, so I had tons of horses growing up. My favorite was this old bay mare named Kamal. And when I was in junior high, I came home one day and Kamal had cut a hip open on a feeder. And it was so deep that I could put my whole hand in it. And so I called the lady that doctored our horses because we weren't quite fancy enough to use vets. And so I call her and I'm like, Donna, oh my God, you got to come over. You got to give Kamal stitches, right? And she comes over and she looks at her and she's like, oh, no, 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 no. We cannot do stitches. Because that wound was so deep that if we did stitches right there, it would have healed over the top and the inside would have festered and I'd have lost my horse. So instead, every single day, I went out and I cleaned the wound and I doctored her. And eventually we were back off on our adventures together. And she just had a big scar, right? It's the same thing when we're talking about our own grief and our losses. We gotta give it space. We gotta acknowledge the loss. We gotta feel the stuff. And then the next day we gotta do it again, right? until it starts to heal, right? And that takes time, right? So we're not rushing to look healed. We're acknowledging the losses and the hurt, and we're giving it the time to heal. And we're going to take care of ourselves, right? We're going to really purposefully look at what our bodies need, what our souls need. Right? There's been a lot of talk this weekend in particular about triggers, right? And there's either been talk about triggers or there's been actual triggers, right, that are happening live. And so when we think about triggers, triggers are the thing that puts me back in that spot where the bear is chasing me, right? I'm back in the middle of the snow globe. And physiologically, my brain responds the exact same way as if I was back in there, right? Our bodies go back in that spot and we get really scared or we get overwhelmed or whatever the state was when we were having it, right? And so there's two different types of triggers that we kind of think about. Some of the triggers are things that we can manage and some of the things that we're allowed to avoid, right? And then we also kind of separate them in things that we can expect or the ones that come out of the blue, right? So as many of these triggers that I can identify as possible, I want to notice. I want to notice if there's a smell. I want to notice if I take a certain road to the hospital and that puts me in a bad spot, I might have a client take the long way around, right? That's okay. Not a problem. Okay? If we recognize that that's a trigger that's going to put you in a hard spot, don't go down that road, right? Not a problem. Some of the things that we can't avoid going to the hospital most of the time, right? And so those are ones that I'm going to recognize I have to figure out how to manage, right? And so if I do that though, then I'm going to look for those things that help me cope. So I might look at stuff like if I've got a family going back into the hospital, like, okay, what are some things like, let's get some scented lotions in case the scents are putting you in a bad spot, right? Let's do something that helps differentiate the times between a routine EEG and an emergency visit, right? Especially focused on our sensory stuff, right? Because that's the part that gets most triggered, that gets the most activated. We're going to notice when things come up and the things that need to be worked through, right? But we're also going to give ourselves grace that you probably have triggers that nobody else has, right? So I was in the Walmart parking lot when I got my daughter's diagnosis. Her doctor called and said they were canceling brain surgery because the test came back. And on the phone call in the middle of Walmart, she says she's going to have an intellectual disability. There's not a cure. She's going to have a limited lifespan and she's just going to have seizures until she dies in the Walmart park. And in the 12 years or 13 years, whatever it is on this journey, the next appointment was, I think, the only appointment I've ever canceled because going to the doctor that next time was too much, right? But I finally go to see the doctor again and I'm like, I need to understand when you say, she said shortened lifespan. I said, when you say shortened lifespan, what does that mean? Are we talking 40? Are we talking whatever, right? And she looks at me with no emotion and says, you'll be lucky if she lives to 18. Now, especially for you new mamas, that is not accurate, right? So I don't want you to spend a second thinking that it is. But that's what I had come at me. To this day, if you call me lucky, I feel like vomiting. I hate that word. It's repulsive to me, right? And that's okay. That's a trigger for me, right? And because it's a trigger for me, people that are close to me know not to use that word and they protect my heart because that's not, I would rather you use the most vile cuss word than call me lucky, 100%, right? To this day, I don't park in that. I'm one of those people that parks in the same spot every day. Like, I will never again park in that row at Walmart, right? And that's okay. If I couldn't go to Walmart anymore, I'd be in trouble because I live way out in the sticks and we're 45 minutes from the nearest Target. And so I don't have another option, but it's okay if I don't park in that same spot, right? Most people, Walmart parking spots probably aren't a trigger, okay? We want to recognize these things that are tied to those really, really scary, hard moments for you. And we're going to recognize, hey, here's the part that triggers me. Here's the place that puts me right back on that phone call, right? And we're going to figure out how we manage it. Is it a thing we can skirt around? Is it a thing we can like just not deal with? Is it a thing we prepare for? One of the ways that I love to have people prepare is by taking our anniversaries of things and putting them in our phones. So I have a reminder in my phone that tells me when their diagnosis anniversary is, right? And it sends me an alert a little bit beforehand. Right? Because otherwise, what was happening is I would start to see the things in my Facebook memories that would tell me that we were getting close, and my whole body would start to like build up, right? And then I'd be in all sorts of chaos. And when I was able to recognize, it's diagnosis day, then I don't schedule hard things on diagnosis day, right? I'm gonna recognize it's not a good day for me, right? Take some self-care that time. But I'm also gonna do things like tell myself it's coming so that it doesn't catch me off guard, right? So whatever the dates are that have trauma for you, put them down. Like they're a lot easier to manage when we know they're coming, right? And we're going to practice when especially those unexpected ones come, having some coping skills in our pockets. Right? So maybe that means doing things like here's a breathing strategy that I really like to use, or here's an oil that I practice smelling. Right? Scent is a super powerful thing that helps you change brain states, and so it's a really great one. But we're looking for those things that we can do super quick and easy when we go back into that really hard spot. So a lot of times what happens is that not only do I get triggered, but my kid gets triggered at the same time. And then it's just a whole tornado, right? So I've got to be able to get myself, my own body regulated so that I can show up for that, right? But we're looking at this, right? And I do want to mention too, like as professionals, sometimes we have to traumatize our clients or our patients, right? If I've got a kiddo in front of me that's suicidal, I have to tell these parents, like, your child wants to kill themselves and I need you to go straight to the hospital. And that is inherently traumatizing for most people, right? Especially the first time. Sometimes we have to do those things that bring trauma. We're not avoiding telling people truth, but there's a really big difference in the way that we tell it, right? So we used to have this doctor that was just like a phenomenal neuro. His name was Dr. McLaughlin, and he was known for just being like the best human. He was a phenomenal doctor, but just an awesome human. And so he was one of our first. And I remember at the time I was in grad school, and our initial plan was that I was going to get my PhD, and we were going to go work overseas for an NGO and teach locals how to provide mental health care, and we had this grand plan, right? And CJ just got bad to the point where I had to have this honest conversation with him. Like, can Alyssa go overseas, right? And the answer was no. He was like, she's in too much crisis. She has to be near modern medical, all the things. But the only thing I remember, like I was crushed. But the thing I remember about that time was his kindness, right? Like we tell the truth to our people, but we can do it with kindness in ways that does not inflict additional trauma. We're not purposefully breaking snow globes. We're going to have to shake them sometimes, but we don't have to take a sledgehammer to them. And then we start really paying attention at doing things like coping with our challenges and just giving permission to be where we are, finding the things that fit for you in the moment, recognizing that's going to change over time, right? And giving ourselves permission to think about both the immediate and the long term, right? And we figure out where we fit here, right? What is on this journey that I never planned to be on? What does my voice sound like? Who are the people that I need? What do I need to do to take care of me? I love to especially have couples sit down and have a conversation about what did you expect parenting to look like, right? Because there is, again, that difference between football player versus chess champion versus football player versus can't walk, right? And so I want to know, what were the things that you really imagined when you dreamed about being a kid? Nobody gets them exact, but ours are way different. And so I'm looking for, like, is this a thing we have to grieve? Or is there a part of it that we can still claim? Right? What's that piece? We're just going to give it words. Right? The thing that's really beautiful about doing that work is that it gives us permission to parent the kids that we actually have. If we try to hold things in and we pretend like everything's okay, we pretend like this hasn't rattled us to our core, then often we're pushing our kids to be the people we thought that they were going to be. We're doing things like, oh, we're just not going to let them be behind. Like, some of our kids are just going to be behind. And so we're going to recognize that this is where they are and this is who they are. And we're just going to meet them there. Right? This is where acceptance happens, is when we've done the work to grieve the loss. Right? We also want to give ourselves time to just be parents for a little while. A lot of times parents can get so stuck in, I go to work and then I come home and we do the things from OT and then we do their homework and then speech said to do this and this person said to do this, and you spend your whole day doing all the checkbox things that we never get the fun parts. We never get to just sit on the couch and cuddle with our kids or just get to see their eyes light up. And sometimes that's the thing that needs to happen. That's the thing that sometimes is more important, right? As parents, we have to take off the advocate, therapist, teacher, all the hats for a little while and let ourselves just be mom and dad, right? Just be the parents to this kiddo that we love. Because that's a thing that we lose a lot of times in this. Right? It helps us remember why we fell in love with this kiddo in the first place. But a lot of times when we're doing that, we're going to start super, super small, right? Especially if you're in that spot where kids' behaviors have been super hard for a while. If you sit down and you're like, okay, we're going to spend an hour together every day, it's going to be a disaster. Just don't try that, right? Don't even. Let's start with 5 minutes. Let's look at the time in your day where you can build in a 5-minute chunk of enjoying your child, right? Of a little bit of a connection. Not magic, just a tiny bit. And then we'll build from there. But that's the part of parenting that makes parenting perfect, right? That's the reason why we're moms and dads, is for that part, not so we can be therapists all day. So we have to give ourselves a little bit of that. Okay? And then when we need to, we get support. Because like I said, a lot of my clients come in with diagnosable PTSD. A lot of moms come in with functional depression. We get in spots where there's depression, there's anxiety, there's attachment issues, relationship issues. And so these are really common, and a lot of people need help with it along the way. Right? And so we're paying attention to the signs that we might be struggling. And we have a lot of those clinical signs like you're feeling down for at least 2 weeks, or you're not sleeping. I always like to pay attention to the things that are different for you specifically, right? Like, I know that if I start messing up my calendar, something's off for me, right? That's a big sign. I know that if I start listening to a lot of 90s country music, I'm probably depressed. Everybody needs like a little bit of Randy Travis in their lives, but if it's on repeat, I'm probably depressed, right? And a lot of times it's easier to notice, oh, you know what? Spotify is only showing Randy Travis and George Strait. I might be depressed, than it is to notice, hey, you know what? Actually, I've had trouble getting out of bed for the last month, right? Those signs are often easier for us to catch. And we want to get help before it gets bad. Anytime that we're having trouble and that hard stuff lasts, if it gets hard to handle our daily tasks, we're having trouble taking care of our kiddos, anytime that we're ever having thoughts of hurting ourselves or anybody else, we're going to get help right away. And we're going to do that. A lot of times we can do, like, the first level of support is things like our Facebook groups or support groups. But then especially once we're having those harder stuff, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look for counseling. And we're going to look for someone specifically who really understands this journey. and who can really help you in a way that's realistic. Okay. But remember, this is hard. It feels hard because it is hard. Okay. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent. Doesn't mean you're not the right parent for your kiddo. It just means you need extra help because this is extra hard. Okay. One day you're going to look back and you're going to be amazed at the progress and the growth that you've made. One day you'll look back and you'll be like, oh my goodness, I struggled so hard right there. And I can help people in that spot now, right? And you'll hit other hard things, right? But we learn to carry them. It's not always going to hurt like this. It's not going to be pretty, right? It's not going to be this little flowery butterfly thing. But we do learn to manage it. So I wanted to finish with my favorite poem, which really, like, I love because it's this thing, like, this is what hope actually looks like for us, but it's not pretty and flowery and neurotypical. So it's called Hope is Not a Bird by Caitlin Saida. It says, hope is not the thing with feathers that comes home to roost when you need it most. Hope is an ugly thing with teeth and claws and patchy fur that's seen some shit. It's what thrives in the discards and survives in the ugliest parts of our world, able to find a way to go on when nothing else can even find a way in. It's the gritty, nasty little carrier of such diseases as optimism, persistence, perseverance, and joy. Transmissible as it drags its tail across your path and bites you in the ass. Hope is not some delicate, beautiful bird, Emily. Where's Emily Dickinson? It's a lowly little sewer rat that snorts pesticides like they were lines of coke and still shows up on time to work the next day looking no worse for the wear. You will not come through this unbattered, but there is hope and we will make it. And those are some of the books that I always recommend for some of my families.
Can you come to every single new patient time? This is an extended visit for them. That'd be pretty good, right? Today. Good questions for me. I will say I'm feeling badly in the sense that we at our center have a therapist that works with our families, and she's a mom of one of my patients with pervasive neuro, and she developed. I'd love to introduce it to you. She developed a set of cards, and I'm feeling badly because I should have brought a bunch of them to hand out, but they're called Life Support for Epilepsy.
Is that the one that was here a few years ago?
Yes.
Yeah, I found it.
That has a lot of these similar take-home messages, and don't get angry with your neurologist. That's my favorite kind. There's what to do when you do get angry with your neurologist, and then they do
sometimes get angry with
yes, exactly.
Not a question, just a comment. So what we found is, you thinking when you're having struggle, when you go to somebody, that would be your spouse. But what we found is that you're both coping very differently in very different places on that. And he would be stuck in anger, and I couldn't deal with that. Right. And just like we're saying, it made me feel like he was angry with the child, and I couldn't cope with that. So what we found is that not to help, but we needed separate therapists because we could not be that person for each other. And that felt like a failure at first, but then I realized that's because we're just in such different places.
So I always prefer to see couples if possible. If you don't have somebody that knows how to do it, they have to be separate. Absolutely.
We did couples therapy too at some
right.
point when we were struggling with interactions.
Right.
But as far as the grieving process, and it worked out better.
Yeah, for some people it does. There's some really cool research. So like they did this study in Canada where they hooked women up to an fMRI machine and they would flash a red light in front of their faces and then they would shock their ankles, right? And so we know they're always getting the same voltage, always the same thing. And they're looking, and unsurprisingly, when the brain lights up or when the red light goes off, your brain shows that you're afraid because you're about to get shocked. And then when they ask you, did it hurt? You're like, yes, it hurt. I got shocked, right? But then they came back and they had women the same women in the fMRI, and they held their husband's hand. And if you hold your husband's hand, if you're in a healthy relationship and you hold your husband's hand and you get that exact same shock, your brain, the fear doesn't light up in your brain. And they rate that exact same voltage shock at a lower level of pain. If we can go to the spot where we address the emotional stuff underneath and we help you figure out how to be the emotional support, which is really hard and not all therapies are appropriate for. So if I'm sitting there telling you coping skills or here's like these communication tools, you're just going to beat each other over the head with them, right? But if we learn how to do that emotional support for each other, then we do it better. They also had this study where they took people and they took them to the base of a mountain. And they asked them, how tall is this mountain and how long is it going to take you to climb it? And then they had them come back to that mountain with their person, right? And if you look at that exact same mountain and you have your person with you, it's not as tall. And you don't think it's going to take as long for you to climb that mountain. Mountains become more climbable when our person is in the journey with us. And then they came back a year or two ago and they actually had people climb the mountain. And they didn't show as much physiological stress when they climbed it with their person, right? So if we can figure out, like, how do we get the support? How do we get that reconnection? Then that's the thing that actually makes a huge difference for a lot of us. But also a lot of us are told, I've had multiple families who've had had professionals sit them down while they were in the NICU saying to these moms, just so you know, you're gonna get divorced. You're not going to make this marriage, is not going to make it. So you need to go ahead and prepare yourself for it. Okay? Just so you know, this is going to tear y'all apart. Okay? And if you don't know what you're doing and you're floundering and you're drowning, of course, right? But if we support families and we help people get the help and they get the oxygen they need, then we can help relationships just be beautiful, right? So it's really a both. Like sometimes, absolutely, especially when we've got hard pieces, there's some things you can't say in front of your spouse, especially when you're in the middle of it, and you need to be able to have that space to own that truth, right? And work through it, right? But one thing I would add to like talking about therapy, the one that I specifically recommend is called emotionally focused therapy. And it can be for individuals or couples, but it's the only couples therapy that actually has research showing it works for special needs families, which is incredibly rare, right? There's things like EMDR that are really popular for trauma, right? And so we want to be kind of cautious with those. If you're going into EMDR and you're doing something like, I'm going to focus on this really bad hospital stay or this really bad incident, it can be really helpful for that. If you're looking at something like the overwhelming trauma response that we actually need to keep, EMDR is not very good for that because it helps my kids for me to have a trauma response, right? If I hear my daughter start to have a seizure and I jump out of bed and I immediately respond and I know what to do, she stays alive, right? It's to her benefit for me to have that response. If it gets too big, that's problematic, right? But I don't want to erase that response. So I can use stuff like that to help with specific things. The other thing about EMDR for those of you who have who've had PCDH19 yourself is that it's not recommended for people with epilepsy because it can potentially trigger seizures. But yeah, like we've got to find therapists who understand and who really give you the space to say the hard things and work through this stuff. Daniel.
I just want to take the time to say thank you so much for that presentation. I found it hugely empowering, especially when I'm at a stage in our journey, and that's a trigger word for some people, but where it's a safe space to explore some of the grief and process some of the journey whilst I'm not in the peak of the crisis like I was. So thank you, Lee. That was amazing.
Okay.
All right. With that, thank you, Lee. We have some wrap-up comments. I guess I want to thank you all for not only just for coming. You said people have traveled from far, distances, but for remaining incredibly engaged, right? And when Julie and I were talking about, we wanted to have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A after every talk. You all filled that space, and it wasn't just filler. I think meaningful, engaging, back and forth with the scientists, with the various presenters over the course of the 2 days. So we're going to do this again, right? Stay tuned. Maybe in a different location. It's maybe a little bit easier for people to travel to, but feedback and what we would like in the future. Yeah. So remain engaged with the Alliance. Obviously, this is all made possible because of you. So with that, let's break for lunch, continue mingling, and safe travels to everyone wherever you may be going. So thank you.